Adaeze had learned early that poverty could make a person invisible. In her father's village, people remembered his name with lowered voices, but they rarely remembered his daughter, who cleaned houses to survive. For 3 years, she worked inside Chidi's family home, waking before sunrise to sweep the courtyard, prepare breakfast, and polish the old study where her father's photograph quietly gathered dust. Chidi had once barely noticed her. He was usually away managing the family company, carrying the confidence of a man raised around money, expectations, and people who answered when he spoke. Adaeze never resented him. She kept her dignity, worked carefully, and refused to accept pity. But she noticed things others ignored, especially mistakes hidden inside documents that powerful people assumed nobody would question. One rainy afternoon, Chidi returned unexpectedly and found Adaeze studying a bundle of old business papers left open on the study table. She immediately stepped back, expecting anger for touching something beyond her position. Instead, Chidi asked what she had seen. Adaeze hesitated, then pointed to a figure that did not match another entry. She explained the difference calmly, without realizing that one small observation would change both their lives. Chidi checked the records himself. She was right. Money had been moved between accounts in a way that made no sense, yet nobody in the company had noticed the inconsistency. For the first time, Chidi looked at Adaeze differently. She was not simply the young woman who served his family. She understood numbers, noticed patterns, and spoke with a confidence that poverty had never managed to destroy. Their conversations became longer. Adaeze revealed that she had studied accounting before her father's downfall left the family struggling. Chidi admitted that he had inherited a business history he understood less than people assumed. Then Adaeze mentioned her father's name. Chidi went silent. His father had always described her as the partner whose careless decisions nearly destroyed the company decades earlier. Adaeze had heard another story from her mother. Her father had not betrayed anyone. He had been betrayed, stripped of his shares, and blamed so completely that even old friends eventually stopped defending him. Neither knew whom to believe, but the question created something neither expected: trust. They began searching through archived records, comparing dates, signatures, payments, and forgotten correspondence hidden beneath years of dust. What they found did not prove everything, but it revealed enough to make Chidi uncomfortable. Several transactions had occurred without proper authorization, and the missing records all surrounded the period when Adaeze's father lost control. Chidi confronted his father's old advisor, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, the elderly man became nervous and refused to discuss the past, warning him that some families survived only because certain truths remained buried. Adaeze overheard the warning. That night, she considered leaving the house. She feared that her growing closeness with Chidi would make people blame her for problems she had never caused. Chidi found her packing. He asked why she was going. Adaeze answered that she could not stay where her presence might create trouble between him and his family. Chidi surprised her by saying the trouble had existed long before she arrived. He told her she deserved answers, not accusations, and promised that he would help her search for the truth. From that moment, their relationship changed. They were still careful, still separated by money and family expectations, but they began standing beside each other whenever suspicion or hostility appeared. Then, Ekene, Chidi's cousin and closest business advisor, noticed the growing bond. He warned Chidi that Adaeze was using the old scandal to gain sympathy and possibly claim a fortune that no longer belonged to her family. Chidi rejected the accusation, but Ekene continued feeding doubts into conversations with relatives and board members. Soon, whispers spread through the house that the maid had become too ambitious and was manipulating the heir. Adaeze endured the insults quietly until one evening when a family meeting turned cruel. A senior relative accused her of stealing confidential documents. Adaeze placed the documents on the table and proved they had been planted. Her composure silenced the room. Chidi stood beside her, refusing to let anyone humiliate her again. Yet, the confrontation also exposed something darker. Someone inside the family wanted Adaeze discredited. That night, Chidi admitted that he no longer trusted the people closest to him. Adaeze told him trust should never be given because of wealth, blood, or status. It should be earned through truth. Their honesty brought them closer. What had begun with a simple accounting mistake became an unlikely partnership, then friendship, finally a feeling neither dared name. But the past was not finished with them. Deep inside an old cabinet, among documents nobody had opened for years, a locked wooden box waited silently for the right person to discover it. Months passed after the discovery of the locked box, and the distance between Chidi and Adaeze slowly disappeared. Their family still watched them carefully, but neither could deny what had grown between them through hardship, truth, and shared courage. When Chidi finally asked Adaeze to marry him, she stood speechless beneath the mango tree behind the house. She had imagined many futures, but never one where the man she once served would hold her hand and ask her to become his wife. Their wedding was simple but deeply emotional. Adaeze wore a modest white dress, while Chidi stood proudly beside her, knowing that the woman beside him had earned respect through character, intelligence, patience, and courage rather than inheritance. For Adaeze, the ceremony carried another meaning. She was no longer entering Chidi's family as a servant. She was entering as an equal, carrying the memory of her parents and the painful history that had shaped her childhood. After the wedding, their home became peaceful. Adaeze returned to professional accounting work, while Chidi expanded his responsibilities within the family company. Their evenings were quieter, filled with ordinary conversations that once seemed impossible. Yet, happiness did not erase memory. Whenever Adaeze passed her father's photograph, something inside her tightened. Chidi had helped restore his shares and reputation, but she still felt that the story they knew was incomplete. One afternoon, Adaeze entered the old study alone while searching for a financial report. Dust covered the shelves and sunlight slipped through the curtains. As she moved a stack of forgotten documents, her fingers touched rough wood beneath them. She pulled out a small wooden box, darkened by age and secured with a rusted lock. Her heart began beating faster because the box carried the initials of her father and Chidi's father across its faded lid. Chidi joined her minutes later. Together they found an old key hidden inside a desk drawer. When the lock finally opened, neither spoke as they stared at photographs, financial statements, handwritten notes, and a damaged partnership agreement. Adaeze lifted the agreement carefully. Her father's name was printed beside Chidi's father, but a third name appeared below them. She looked at Chidi confused because neither had ever heard that name mentioned in company records. The name belonged to a businessman called Nnamdi Okoro, whose involvement apparently began during the company's earliest years. Yet every official document they had previously examined had erased his existence completely. Adaeze spread the papers across the table. Several transactions showed money moving through unfamiliar accounts around the exact period when her father lost his shares. Her accounting instincts immediately told her the pattern was deliberate rather than accidental. Chidi became uneasy as she explained the connection. He had always believed his father's version of events, even after evidence began challenging it. Now he wondered whether the family had misunderstood their own history. Adaeze spent long nights tracing the numbers. She compared old bank statements with company ledgers, searching for repeated amounts and hidden transfers. Each discovery connected another piece of a financial trail that appeared carefully designed to remain unnoticed. Meanwhile, Chidi contacted former employees and retired auditors. Some remembered little, some refused to speak, and others suddenly became nervous when Nnamdi's name surfaced. Their silence frightened Chidi more than any accusation could have. One retired accountant finally admitted that money had disappeared before the company crisis became public. He said several people knew, but they were pressured to remain silent because powerful men controlled the business and feared losing everything. The revelation changed how Chidi remembered his father. The man he had respected all his life might have been manipulated, or perhaps he chose silence when protecting the company became more important than protecting a friend. Adaeze struggled with anger. She wanted to blame everyone responsible, but Chidi reminded her that they still needed evidence. Revenge would not restore her father's truth. Only facts strong enough to survive public scrutiny could do that. Then, Chidi received an unexpected proposal from a wealthy investor named Victor Eze. Victor presented himself as a respected businessman with international connections and offered enormous funding to expand Chidi's company across several West African markets. The offer appeared almost too generous. Chidi saw an opportunity to rebuild the company into something larger than his father had imagined. Victor was polished, confident, and surrounded by successful people who spoke highly of him. Adaeze remained cautious. She reviewed the investors' documents before the agreement could be signed, checking ownership structures, financial statements, and previous partnerships. Nothing seemed immediately wrong until she noticed one signature buried inside an old supporting document. Her eyes fixed on the page. The handwriting looked strangely familiar, but she could not understand why. She pulled the wooden box closer, compared the signature with the damaged partnership agreement, and felt her stomach drop. The signatures were nearly identical. Victor Eze's document carried the same distinctive mark connected to Nnamdi Okoro, the mysterious third partner from decades earlier. Adaeze called Chidi into the room and quietly showed him what she had found. Chidi refused to believe the connection immediately. Victor was too successful, too respected, and too well connected. Adaeze understood his hesitation, but she also knew that numbers did not care about reputation. She traced Victor's company through the records and discovered accounts linked to the same financial network that had appeared around her father's lost shares. The past was no longer distant. It had walked directly into their marriage and business. The next morning, Chidi invited Victor to the company office and asked him to explain the documents. Adaeze sat nearby, quietly holding copies of the old partnership agreement, determined not to let fear make her doubt what the evidence had revealed. Victor entered smiling confidently, unaware that his polished reputation was about to collapse. He greeted Chidi warmly, then noticed Adaeze's presence. His smile faded slightly, as though seeing her reminded him of something he had hoped remained forgotten. Chidi placed the documents on the table and asked about Nnamdi Okoro. Victor stared at the name for several seconds before leaning back. He claimed his father had been a minor businessman with no serious connection to Chidi's family. Adaeze asked why Victor's signature matched the signature attached to Nnamdi's partnership records. Victor immediately denied signing the old agreement, insisting that signatures could resemble each other. His calm response sounded reasonable, but Adaeze noticed his hands trembling. Then, Chidi presented banking records connecting Victor's company to accounts used during the period when Adaeze's father lost his shares. Victor stopped speaking. The confidence disappeared from his face, replaced by a silence that answered more than words could. After several tense minutes, Victor finally admitted that his father had been involved with the company. He claimed Nnamdi had acted independently, but Adaeze challenged him with evidence showing that the financial transfers continued through businesses Victor later inherited. Victor became defensive, accusing Adaeze of reopening old wounds simply because she wanted money. Chidi stood immediately and warned him never to insult his wife again. The room fell silent as Victor realized their marriage had made them stronger. Under pressure, Victor revealed that his father had manipulated the original partnership during a period of financial difficulty. Nnamdi secretly moved company funds, created false records, and convinced Chidi's father that Adaeze's father was responsible for the losses. The betrayal had been carefully planned. When Adaeze's father questioned the missing money, documents were produced showing false debts in his name. His shares were then transferred under circumstances that appeared legal, leaving him powerless to defend himself. Chidi listened with tears gathering in his eyes. He understood that his father had not created the betrayal, but he had accepted a lie because it protected the company from collapse and allowed the family to avoid scandal. Adaeze felt anger rising inside her, but she remembered her father's photograph. She wanted justice, yet she did not want hatred to control her. She asked Victor one final question: whether Nnamdi ever regretted what he had done. Victor looked away and admitted that his father had feared the truth for years. Before his death, Nnamdi had destroyed some records, but kept others because he believed the company's future would eventually depend on the hidden evidence. That revelation gave Adaeze a strange sense of sadness. The people responsible had spent decades protecting themselves, while her family had carried the consequences. She finally understood how easily one dishonest decision could poison generations. Victor agreed to cooperate with the investigation after realizing the evidence could no longer be hidden. Chidi contacted independent auditors and legal advisors, while Adaeze organized the financial records into a clear timeline. For weeks, they worked through old statements, contracts, and correspondence. Each document strengthened their case. Money that seemed missing was traced through several shell businesses before eventually returning to companies controlled by Nnamdi's family. During those long nights, Adaeze also remembered her mother's belongings stored in an old trunk. Her mother had kept almost everything from their former life, including letters and photographs she had never allowed anyone to touch. Adaeze opened the trunk slowly. Beneath folded clothes and faded family pictures, she discovered an envelope marked with her father's handwriting. Her fingers trembled because she recognized the writing immediately, even after all those years. Inside was a letter dated months before his death. Her father explained that he had discovered the financial deception and understood that several powerful people were involved, yet he feared exposing them would place his wife and daughter in danger. Adaeze read the letter twice before tears covered her face. Her father had not surrendered because he was guilty or weak. He had remained silent because protecting his family mattered more than restoring his reputation. Chidi sat beside her without speaking. Adaeze finally leaned against him and cried, releasing years of anger she had never allowed herself to express. For the first time, she mourned her father without feeling ashamed of his story. The letter also explained where he had hidden additional evidence. He trusted that one day Adaeze would become strong enough to understand what he could not safely reveal. That sentence broke her heart and healed something inside her. Chidi promised that the truth would never be buried again. He told Adaeze that her father's sacrifice had protected her, and now they would honor that sacrifice by bringing every hidden fact into the light. Together, they submitted the evidence to investigators and company authorities. False records were challenged, ownership documents were reviewed, and the financial network connected to Nnamdi's family was finally exposed publicly. The investigation confirmed that Adaeze's father had been wrongfully stripped of his shares. His contribution was officially restored, his name was cleared, and the company acknowledged that his work had helped build the foundation everyone later benefited from. Adaeze expected Victory to feel joyful, but instead she felt tearful. Justice could not return her father, yet it could finally remove the shame that had followed their family for decades. She placed the letter beside her father's photograph that evening. Chidi stood behind her, quietly holding her shoulders. Adaeze smiled through tears, realizing that the truth had not only restored a name, it had restored the family's dignity. The weeks after the investigation were difficult, but for the first time, Adaeze woke without carrying shame that belonged to someone else. Her father's name had been restored, and the company had formally recognized the shares stolen from her family. Chidi stood beside her during every meeting, refusing to let anyone reduce Adaeze's victory to luck. He reminded the board that her accounting knowledge had uncovered the truth, while her courage had pushed them to confront it. Victor cooperated fully with investigators, providing records that confirmed his father's role. Although his reputation suffered, he accepted responsibility for exposing what his family had hidden. Adaeze understood that accountability mattered more than revenge. Some relatives still struggled to accept the truth. A few quietly blamed Adaeze for reopening painful memories, saying the past should have remained buried. She listened calmly, knowing silence had already cost her family too much. Chidi's relationship with his relatives also changed. He could no longer pretend that protecting family reputation mattered more than honesty. For the first time, he openly questioned old decisions and demanded that future business dealings be built on transparency. Adaeze returned to the old study and touched the wooden box resting on the table. What had once represented mystery now represented courage. She realized that the box had not destroyed their peace. It had finally made peace possible. Then, Adaeze remembered the children in her village who had grown up watching poverty steal opportunities from capable families. Her father's restored wealth could easily become another private fortune, but she wanted his legacy to mean something greater. She proposed creating an educational foundation using part of the recovered assets. The initiative would provide scholarships, school materials, and financial support for struggling families, especially children whose parents had been pushed into hardship. Chidi immediately supported her idea. Together, they established a program carrying Adaeze's father's name. They promised that the foundation would never be used to glorify wealth, but to create opportunities for people who had been overlooked. Months later, the first scholarship ceremony took place in a small community hall. Parents sat quietly while students received books and letters of support. Adaeze watched them carefully, remembering how often she had once wondered whether education could save her family. One young girl approached Adaeze afterward and thanked her for believing that poor children deserved opportunities. Adaeze struggled to answer because the girl's words reminded her of herself, the young woman who had once hidden her ambitions behind household duties. That evening, Adaeze told Chidi that she no longer felt embarrassed by the years she spent working as a housemaid. Those years had taught her patience, discipline, and the dignity of honest work. Chidi smiled and admitted that he had once been blind to the intelligence standing quietly inside his family home. Adaeze laughed softly, reminding him that sometimes people only notice value after life forces them to look carefully. Their marriage also changed through everything they had survived. They argued sometimes, especially when business became stressful, but neither allowed fear to turn disagreement into distrust. Both had learned that love required honesty, listening, and patience. One afternoon, Chidi brought Adaeze to the company courtyard where workers had gathered around a newly mounted plaque honoring her father. His name now stood beside the founders, no longer hidden behind old accusations. Adaeze stood before the plaque and slowly traced the letters with her fingers. For years, she had imagined her father's name disappearing forever. Seeing it restored made her chest ache with pride. She remembered her childhood home, her mother's quiet tears, and the neighbors who once whispered that her father had ruined everything. None of those words could erase what she now knew. Her father had been imperfect, but he had not betrayed his partners. He had fought quietly to protect his family and preserved evidence for the daughter he believed would someday understand what happened. That night, Adaeze placed the old letter beside his photograph. She did not cry this time. Instead, she smiled and whispered that she finally understood why he had chosen silence when speaking could have destroyed them all.
Chidi entered and stood beside her. He reminded Adaeze that their fathers had once built a company together with hopes for their families. Their mistakes had nearly destroyed that dream, but their children now had a chance to rebuild it honestly. Adaeze looked at him and realized how strange their journey had been. She had entered his home as a housemaid expecting nothing beyond survival, yet life had brought her love, dignity, justice, and a future she could never have imagined. She understood now that wealth had never truly been the measure of her worth. Her intelligence, honesty, compassion, and courage had carried her through every difficult season, long before anyone with money chose to recognize them. The painful history between their families would always remain part of them, but it no longer controlled their future. The secrets had been exposed, the stolen legacy restored, and the bitterness that once divided everyone had finally lost its power. Chidi took Adaeze's hand as they stood before her father's photograph. Neither spoke for a moment. They simply looked at the man whose unfinished dream had survived betrayal, poverty, silence, and time. Adaeze smiled through quiet tears. Her father's name had been restored, his truth had been heard, and his legacy was helping others. She finally understood that his dream had not been lost. It had finally come home.